These tariffs are not just a temporary disruption, especially for smaller importers. They've basically completely reshaped how they operate.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our quick rundown of our trade war survey. I'm Jude Levine, and I'm joined by Adam Lewis, who is president at Clearit Customs Brokerage. And basically, this survey was the third one we did in 2025. Now we're moving into 2026. We did one in May, we did one in August, and then we did this latest one towards the end of the year in November. And the survey was conducted by Freightos together with Clearit. And we surveyed more than 200 importers, mostly small businesses, SMBs, to explore how they're being impacted by the trade war and what steps the businesses are taking to adapt. And so again, we ran this 3 times over the course of last year to see how things are evolving. And really this time, spoiler alert, this time the results showed that importers really continue to be significantly disrupted and face higher costs. A lot of them are reducing shipment volumes. And this is despite much more stability, more trade deals announced, China-US de-escalations, but still there's a lot of pessimism and expectations of negative impacts or more negative impacts coming. So if we jump into the results, we asked shippers, SMB importers, the extent to which these tariff changes have been disruptive to their business, and we see 62% said significantly. 30% said it's been somewhat disruptive. So that means that 92% have been disrupted in some way from the tariffs and from the tariff increases. And when we asked about how concerned they are about tariffs negatively impacting their business compared to earlier in the year, we see that there's still much more concern, or concern is growing. So if we compare to our first survey back in May, they were about as concerned as they were earlier in the year, which is kind of really the beginning of tariff introductions. When we asked in the summer, many were more concerned than they had been earlier in the year. And then we moved to November, and again, there's a lot of more clarity or stability. There's still many, more than 50% are more concerned even than they were back in August. Only many were more concerned than they were back in May. And then finally, when we asked them how they think the tariffs or the trade war are going to impact their sales, do they think sales are going to be stronger than usual, about the same, or weaker than usual? So again, we asked them first on Memorial Day, then when they were heading into back to school, and then ahead of the holiday season, just latest one. And we see that the expectations of sales being weaker than usual have gotten higher each time, or more significant each time we've asked throughout this year. And that's despite in the U.S. really a lot of resilience. If we look about retail spending, it's remained pretty strong. Inflation is actually lower than a lot of people had expected it to be. But nonetheless, there's a lot of pessimism. Of course, there seems to be distinctions between, higher income families and lower income households in terms of how they're spending and how they're able to spend. But nonetheless, there's a lot more economic health than a lot expected. Adam, what are you hearing when you talk to SMB importers that you come across through dealing with customs? How are you hearing that they're being impacted, or their perceptions of what's going on?
Yeah. Look, what I'm hearing and really what the survey is confirming, kind of what we already know in the business is that, these tariffs are not just a temporary disruption, especially for smaller importers. They've basically completely reshaped how they operate. We moved on from really an initial shock to seeing some real structural strain. Looking over this survey, when almost 2/3 of SMBs are still describing elevated tariffs as significantly disruptive 9 months into this, it's not just resistance to change. It's really kind of like pressure with no relief. So they're not taking it well. Still 9 months into it, and it's been difficult.
And from your perspective, do you think SMBs are experiencing this a lot differently than maybe larger importers? And what are some of the differences there?
Yeah, definitely. And, we've talked about this before. Larger importers can absorb or deflect, elevated tariffs more easily. They have the resources to do it. And small businesses just deal with them and feel it immediately. Big companies, they can hedge, they can negotiate with suppliers, in terms of pricing, they can spread out their costs. Smaller importers, they simply just cut volumes. And when, almost half of small businesses are saying they're reducing volumes. This isn't just strategy, it's them trying to survive.
Yeah, and we're going to see a little bit more about that in the survey in a minute. Um, as I said a couple minutes ago, interesting from this round of the survey compared to earlier rounds is like there really was a lot more stability and clarity in terms of the tariff landscape and what to expect for the next year compared to what we saw in 2025. So by the time we did the survey in November, there was already this de-escalation between China and US, which means this 30% baseline tariff or 20% baseline tariff is going to be set for until November of 2026. We had at this point announcements of trade deals with the UK, with the EU, South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand. Some of these were announcements, some of these were frameworks, some of these were more concrete, but it seemed to be a lot more clarity than they had earlier in the year. Nonetheless, when we asked, how are you being impacted by these recent trade deals? And I think my expectations were, well, at least we have clarity. Not sure there'll be higher costs, but at least I know what the tariffs are going to be. We saw that really only a quarter have thought that it made planning easier. More than 30% said it was still difficult because of the higher costs makes planning difficult. In other words, they don't know what their sales are going to be like because they might have to raise prices. And 40%, the biggest section, said it made no difference, right? Which to me was surprising. Why, Adam, do you think this wasn't seen as more of a win or more of a positive development?
Yeah, I mean, stability is a good thing. And, yes, tariffs are more stable now. And the worst case scenario, didn't happen. But ultimately, stability at elevated levels is not a win for small businesses. So, they may have learned to operate with this strain or this pain, but it's still there. And I think ultimately predictability without affordability, still forces very conservative behavior. And again, that goes back to, reducing volumes overall and tighter inventory, which is, it's tough to work with.
Yeah, and I imagine that that's also another area where there's a difference between big enterprises and smaller businesses that are really more dependent on the inventory coming in now, as opposed to being able to build bumpers or other ways to mitigate. And speaking of mitigation, a lot of small volume small business shippers are just shipping less because of the uncertainty of demand, uncertainty of their own costs.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen other steps towards mitigation as well. So the biggest share, more than 40%, said they're just reducing their shipments because of the cost. But we saw other mitigation strategies. Some are changing sourcing partners in the Far East, meaning probably away from China. Other strategies like holding on to inventory before it's being imported to avoid pay customs at whatever the status is right then, or to kind of defer. We have a pausing shipments, pulling orders forward. But we also have, as we said, moving to the Far East, moving sourcing to the US or nearshoring. And I'm wondering, what are you seeing in terms of the shippers that you service? Where are you seeing a real trend towards diversification and nearshoring or reshoring, or putting sourcing partners in the Far East?
Yeah, I mean, for small businesses, we're not seeing nearly as much nearshoring, only because that can ultimately add up costs. What we have been seeing, and this really started years ago, maybe during Trump's first term, is we started seeing more, sourcing diversifications. And just in the last few months, we've seen that really ramp up. But there are hidden costs to just diversification, right? You may have been sourcing from China for years or for decades. You have a good relationship with your supplier. The capacity is always there, which is very important. But what we're seeing now is with, especially SMBs being forced to diversify. It's not necessarily because they want to, but because they feel that they have to. And in a lot of cases, changing suppliers in another region has come at the cost of quality, but most importantly, capacity. So whereas you knew you could buy X amount of your product, on a regular basis, well, the capacity from your new supplier might be half of that or a third of that. So there are some hidden costs there in just saying, okay, well, it's really expensive to import from China right now. I'm going to move to Vietnam. And this is why, again, kind of going back to the survey, when SMBs are saying, oh, if the tariffs disappear tomorrow, we would just go back to our original suppliers in China because the quality is there and most importantly, the capacity.
And where do you hear shippers are diversifying to the most? You mentioned Vietnam. Is that the big one, or what are other regions or countries that you're hearing?
Yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, Korea, India. I mean, like, take your pick. I guess, a lot of manufacturing elsewhere accelerated during Trump's first term once they started putting additional tariffs on China. And, a lot of companies, began to look and say, okay, well, the focus right now is on China and, these elevated tariffs are going to be there. Let's start moving elsewhere. And then, 9 months ago, when the expectations were that, okay, these elevated tariffs are really for China and China only, and then almost every other country gets slapped with some form of elevated tariff. Yeah.
China, I think, faces overall higher tariffs for a good exporter than we think. Yeah. You talked about manufacturing capacity. What about logistics capacity? Do you run into shippers saying, it was actually difficult to get my goods out of there just because the logistics infrastructure is not as developed in most of these countries as it is in China?
I mean, definitely. With so much coming out of China the last 20, 30 years, the infrastructure is there. And a lot of these, emerging manufacturing companies, I wouldn't call them emerging. I mean, they have established business there, but it just doesn't have the same infrastructure. You don't have the same sailing schedules. You don't have the same flights coming out of there. So definitely there's tighter capacity, but that's improving.
You got it. Okay, and then finally, the last part of our survey was really open-ended. We asked the respondents, what are they concerned about? What is their biggest concern moving forward? What would they do if tariffs went away tomorrow? And Adam, as you said, a lot of the answers, tariffs went away tomorrow, I would go back to my manufacturer in China. That's where, all else aside, that's where we would decide to source from. And in general, we heard sentiments like this we have here that they want to go back to doing business based on what's best for the business and on kind of externalities like policies. What are you hearing from SMBs? Does this kind of coalesce around what you're hearing from a lot of the importers you deal with?
Yeah, I mean, one line from the survey really stood out to me, and it's something that I hear all the time. It's like, something to the effect of, they basically missed the days when politics, played a smaller role in their business and in their spreadsheets. It's tough. I mean, trade policy works best really when it sets guardrails and not really when it rewrites the business logic, of how you should run your business. Like good old American capitalism depends really on pricing signals, on quality, on reliable sourcing and long-term planning. And when sourcing decisions are driven by a tariff schedule and a product value, the system breaks. So I totally sympathize and I understand why why I keep hearing this, that they just wish politics would stay out of their business.
Yeah, I think that's, what we saw in a lot of those comments as well. I'm sure we will run the survey again in a couple months. It'll be interesting to see how things play out, or who knows what will have happen by then, if the tariffs will be, struck down by the Supreme Court, there'll be other ones in place. Who knows? It'll be interesting to see what happens. Adam, any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
I mean, look, from a broker's perspective, again, from an SMB side, we're not seeing strategic shifts from small businesses. We're really just seeing defensive maneuvers more so than anything. Importers are just trying to protect their margins and their cash flow and avoid, surprise costs. And, hopefully we can see a reduction in this soon.
Yeah. Well, obviously a lot of uncertainty remains. Okay, Adam, thank you very much for joining once again. If you want to see the full survey results, you can find them at Freightos.com and /freight industry updates. And that's it. We'll see you next time, Adam. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.